An invisible thread connected the impossible promise to a humanity Eduardo thought he'd lost. On that park bench in Ouro Preto, beneath the generous shade of a pinera tree, time seemed to suspend the warm breeze. The man before him, with his tangled beard and tear-filled eyes, wasn't just a beggar. He was a distorted mirror of Eduardo's own pain, yet with an intensity of desperation the millionaire in the wheelchair had never touched. The phrase, "Please, sir, give me your leftover food, and I will grant you a miracle. I will make you walk again," echoed in Eduardo's mind, a stark absurdity against the backdrop of his unchanging reality. He, Eduardo, who had heard it all, promises of miraculous cures from charlatans, pleas for help disguised as scams, and the hollow pity of those who only saw the chair. But in that gaze, in that rasping voice, there was something different, a frankness that disarmed the cynicism he had cultivated for years as a protective wall. It wasn't pity that moved him now, but an almost palpable curiosity. Who was this man who, in destitution, dared to offer a miracle? And what, after all, did Eduardo have to lose? As the driver, always discreet, waited a few yards away, Eduardo made a sign. It was an almost instinctive gesture, coming from a place much deeper than his wallet. He had a snack, a cheese bread and a bottle of water which he had barely touched. With a careful movement, he extended the package. The homeless man took it, with the same reverence one takes a treasure. His thin, calloused fingers trembled slightly. Eduardo observed every detail, like a film director who doesn't want to miss a single frame. The way the man inhaled the smell of the bread before biting into it, the way the water smoothly descended his dry throat. It was a scene of raw beauty, of a need Eduardo only knew in the abstract. Have you ever stopped to think about how a small gesture can change the perspective of a day or even an entire life? How about sharing your name and the city you're watching this story from? I want to get to know you better and feel the energy of our community, which connects through these soul-stirring narratives. As the man ate, Eduardo noticed a small notebook, worn and with a leather cover darkened by time, that slipped from the homeless man's wide pocket and fell to the ground. It was a simple object, almost invisible, but it caught Eduardo's attention. The man, oblivious, continued to devour the bread, his eyes fixed on the food as if it could disappear at any moment. Eduardo pointed to the notebook. "This fell," he said, his voice a little softer than he expected. The homeless man was startled, picked up the notebook quickly, almost fearfully, and put it back as if protecting a secret. That small object, so common and so guarded, planted a seed of mystery in Eduardo's mind. What would be inside? The meal ended too quickly, leaving only the trace of a momentarily satisfied hunger. The homeless man raised his eyes to Eduardo, and this time there was a different light in them. It was no longer desperate pleading, but deep, almost reverent gratitude. "I said I would give you a miracle, sir, and I will fulfill it." Eduardo felt a shiver. The promise, which once seemed like a delusion, now had a strange weight and intensity that couldn't be ignored. He found himself trapped, not by the promise of healing, but by that man's dignity, by the way he faced the impossible. It was as if the universe, in its infinite irony, had placed a hopeless millionaire and a homeless man with unwavering faith face to face. Eduardo shook his head, a bitter smile on his lips. "A miracle, is it?" The homeless man's voice was firm, without hesitation. "Yes, sir, but not the way you think. It's not magic. It's faith and a connection you've forgotten how to have." That phrase hit Eduardo like lightning. A connection. It was exactly what he most desired and most feared. He watched the man stand up with surprising agility for someone who seemed so weak, and before walking away, the homeless man made a simple, almost imperceptible gesture with his hand towards Eduardo's feet. "Soon, sir. Soon you will feel the ground again." And with that, he turned and blended into the crowd that was beginning to fill the square. Eduardo remained there, stunned, his heart beating faster than usual. The driver, who had been watching from afar, approached. "Is everything all right, Mr. Eduardo?" Eduardo merely nodded, his eyes still fixed on the spot where the homeless man had disappeared. He no longer felt the warm breeze, but a cold wind of uncertainty and a strange, almost frightening sense of hope. What was so special about that leather notebook? And what, in fact, did that mysterious man mean by connection? Eduardo's life, once predictable and isolated, had just gained a new and unexpected chapter. He knew something had changed. An invisible gear had been set in motion, and he couldn't, nor did he want to, stop its turning. Eduardo returned to the mansion, but the mansion was not the same. The silence of the corridors, once a refuge, now seemed to amplify the homeless man's voice in his mind. Soon you will feel the ground again, and the connection you forgot how to have. Those words, so simple and so charged, hammered away. The driver dropped him off at the door and left, discreet as always, without asking more questions. Eduardo found himself alone, as usual, but for the first time in years, the solitude was accompanied by an uneasiness that was not bitter, but rather curious. He tried to resume his routine, review documents, read an art book, but the image of the hungry man and the small leather notebook would not leave his head. What was so important there? A diary, poems, or just random notes from a life on the streets? Curiosity was a motor he hadn't felt in a long time, a gentle but insistent push that pulled him out of inertia. He found himself looking out the window, at the mountains fading into the horizon, wondering if the man was still in the square, or if he had disappeared like a ghost. After all, who was that fellow? And how could he know his deepest need, that for a genuine connection? Eduardo knew that his fortune and his condition as a wheelchair user were barriers to intimacy. Many people approached with ulterior motives, and disappointment had become an old companion. But the homeless man didn't ask for money, didn't ask for luxury. He asked for food and offered a miracle in a way that defied all logic. Wasn't that an obstacle in itself? Eduardo's own disbelief. In the following days, Eduardo felt a strange compulsion. He asked the driver to pass through the square again, just to see the activity. He didn't say why, he didn't need to. The driver, with the silent wisdom of one who observes much, simply obeyed. But the man was not there. Not on the bench under the pinera tree, nor in the vicinity. It was as if he had appeared out of nowhere and returned to nowhere. The absence only increased the web of mystery. What did Eduardo expect to find after all? An explanation? Proof? He found himself researching spontaneous miracles about people with gifts. But the internet, full of charlatanism and empty promises, offered no answers that would calm his mind. Distrust, his old friend, whispered that it was all just an act, an elaborate trick to take advantage of his vulnerability. But if it was a trick, what kind of trick was it? The man asked for nothing more than a snack, and didn't even accept the money that Eduardo, in a belated impulse, tried to offer before leaving the square. The seed of mystery planted by the leather notebook began to sprout. Eduardo remembered the protective way the man retrieved it. It wasn't a simple object. It was something valuable. Perhaps a map, perhaps a diary of his life, or who knows, the key to understanding what he had said. That notebook, such a simple object, became a point of fixation, a tangible link to the inexplicable. How could he access it? And did he really want to? He began to observe people on the streets more closely, a habit he had abandoned long ago, preferring the isolation of his bubble. Each anonymous face, each passing figure, could be the miracle man. It was a silent search, almost imperceptible, but it consumed his thoughts. The city, once a distant blur, gained sharper, more human contours. He felt like a detective, looking for clues that only existed in his imagination, but which, somehow, seemed very real. What happens when we allow ourselves to look beyond the obvious, challenging our own certainties? Eduardo found himself at a crossroads. Either he ignored the encounter, attributed it to chance and returned to his protected and bitter life, or he plunged into uncertainty, risking getting hurt again, of being deceived. But the promise of a connection and the sight of that notebook pulled him forward. He felt there was something more, something he needed to unravel, not for the miracle of walking, but for the miracle of feeling again, of believing in something that was not the coldness of the numbers in his bank account. He decided then to go back to the square, but this time with a different purpose. It was no longer passive observation. He wanted information. He wanted to understand. What he didn't know was that this search would lead him to unearth secrets not only about the homeless man, but about the city of Ouro Preto itself, and finally, about himself. The search for the man with the notebook would, in fact, be a journey of self-discovery, paved with the dust of the streets and the complexity of human relationships. It was a point of no return, a step out of his gilded comfort zone, into a world he had closed his eyes to for so long. That small notebook, which he had seen for an instant, was now the thread of a plot unfolding, inviting him to delve into a reality he thought no longer belonged to him. Eduardo returned to the square, but this time not as a passive observer. There was a new determination in his gaze, an urgency he hadn't felt in a long time. The driver, with his usual discretion, dropped him off near the spot where it all began, under the pinera tree, and went to park the car. Eduardo, in his wheelchair, felt more exposed than ever, an easy target for the curious and opportunistic. But the image of the homeless man, the intensity of his eyes, and the mystery of the notebook were stronger than any apprehension. He needed answers. He began his search among the small merchants who brought that part of Ouro Preto to life. A cheese bread vendor, an old lady with her homemade sweet stall, the newspaper seller. The reactions varied, a mix of surprise and distrust. A rich man in a wheelchair asking about a homeless person. It was an unusual scene, generating discreet murmurs and curious glances. Eduardo felt the weight of these glances, the feeling of being judged, of having his sanity questioned. It was an emotional cost, this exposure, but he couldn't back down. Information came in bits and pieces, fragmented, like puzzle pieces scattered on the floor. "Ah, the professor," said the sweets lady with an enigmatic smile. "He appears and disappears. No one knows where he comes from or where he goes." The newspaper seller added, "I've never seen him ask for money, only food. And sometimes he leaves some drawings, some strange writings around. Some people think he's a bit crazy, but he never harmed anyone." "Professor," Eduardo repeated, the word echoing in his mind. It wasn't the name he expected, but it gave a new dimension to the mysterious figure. A man who exchanged miracles for food and was called Professor. What kind of wisdom did he hold in that worn notebook? The city, which once seemed indifferent to him, now revealed secrets among its alleys and its people. If you, like Eduardo, have ever felt alone or distrustful, but still believe that truth and justice can unite us, then you are part of our community. Comment below with the hashtag #MiraclePath what you would do in his place. Your perspective is fundamental to unraveling these stories. The search continued for days. Eduardo went to the square, talked to people, tried to connect the loose ends. With each new conversation, the figure of the homeless man became more complex. He was not a common beggar. He was a local urban legend, a character who for some brought omens, for others just incomprehensible poetry. He discovered that the professor had no fixed spot. He wandered, but always returned to that square, in the shade of the pinera tree, as if it were a meeting point with destiny. On one of these trips, Eduardo met a young graffiti artist, known for documenting daily city scenes on his personal blog. The young man, named Lucas, was retouching a mural on the wall of an old mansion. Eduardo approached, and Lucas, initially reserved, relaxed when he perceived the sincerity in his request. "The professor?" Lucas smiled. He's an inspiration, always with his notebook. Once I took a picture of him distracted while he was writing. He doesn't like to be photographed, but this one turned out well. It captured his essence." Lucas took out his cell phone, quickly scrolled through the photos, and showed it to Eduardo. It was a somewhat blurry image, taken from a distance but unmistakable. The homeless man was sitting on the bench, exactly as Eduardo had seen him, but with the notebook open in his hands. His fingers were on the pages, and there was an expression of deep concentration on his face. The photo didn't reveal the contents of the notebook, but it confirmed its existence and the importance it had for the man. It was the second piece of evidence, a fleeting but powerful image that pulled the man from the realm of imagination and anchored him in reality. Eduardo felt a shiver. The photo, as simple as it was a validation, a tangible link to the mystery. The man existed, the notebook existed, and the promise of a miracle somehow also seemed more real. "Do you know his name?" Eduardo asked Lucas, his voice almost a whisper. Lucas shook his head. "No one knows his real name, sir. They just call him Professor. But they say he's not from here, that he came from far away after a great loss." The information about the great loss ignited a new flame of curiosity in Eduardo. What kind of loss would lead a man to live that way, offering miracles in exchange for food? The image of the notebook in his hands in Lucas's photo, and the idea that he wasn't from Ouro Preto, only deepened the enigma. Eduardo felt that he was beginning to unravel a story much larger than he imagined, a web of life and pain, of faith and disillusionment that intertwined with his own search for meaning and connection. The emotional cost of his investigation was high, but with each new clue, he felt he was approaching something that could, finally, fill the void in his soul. The information about the great loss ignited a new flame of curiosity in Eduardo. What kind of loss would lead a man to live that way, offering miracles in exchange for food? The image of the notebook in his hands in Lucas's photo, and the idea that he wasn't from Ouro Preto, only deepened the enigma. Eduardo felt that he was beginning to unravel a story much larger than he imagined, a web of life and pain, of faith and disillusionment that intertwined with his own search for meaning and connection. The emotional cost of his investigation was high, but with each new clue, he felt he was approaching something that could, finally, fill the void in his soul. Driven by this new direction, Eduardo decided to go beyond informal conversations. If the professor wasn't from Ouro Preto and had suffered a great loss, perhaps there was some record, some trace elsewhere. He instructed his driver, the faithful and silent Joaquim, to take him to the municipal library, an old building with shelves that held not only books, but also collections of local newspapers from past decades. The idea was to look for news of disappearances or tragedies involving a professor in neighboring cities or even more distant ones, but within the state of Minas Gerais. It was a needle in a haystack, he knew, but curiosity was a more powerful engine than discouragement. The task was exhausting. Eduardo spent hours poring over microfilms, his tired eyes fixed on yellowed headlines, looking for any hint that could link a face, a description, to his mysterious man. Joaquim helped him, with monastic patience, turning the cranks of the machine, reading aloud articles that Eduardo could barely decipher on the blurry screen. Days turned into weeks. Eduardo felt the weight of time, but also the adrenaline of the search. He was acting, he was alive in a way he hadn't felt in a long time. It was a lonely, almost obsessive journey. Then, on a muggy afternoon, amidst a pile of newspapers from a small inland town, a few miles from Ouro Preto, a headline caught his attention. Tragedy on the Royal Road, professor's family disappears in mysterious accident. The clipping, dated 15 years earlier, detailed the disappearance of a respected history professor, his wife and daughter, after a landslide on the highway. The car was found, but the bodies were never recovered, only some scattered belongings. The article spoke of a middle-aged man, with a physical description that, although generic, was not entirely inconsistent with that of the homeless man. The professor's name was Elias. The report described his passion for history and for notebooks, where he wrote down his reflections and poems. A detail, almost a whisper in the text, mentioned that Elias had a habit of carrying a small notebook with a darkened leather cover. Eduardo felt an electric shock. A leather notebook. This was the third piece of evidence, a powerful clue that seemed to tie up loose ends but at the same time untied them. The misdirection revealed itself. Could Elias be the professor? But why would he be alive, living on the streets and offering miracles? The report was clear. The bodies were never found, but the police had concluded there were no survivors. The Elias family had been declared legally dead. The town had mourned the loss of one of its most beloved intellectuals. Eduardo felt a pang of disillusionment, mixed with renewed curiosity. It was a sad story, yes, an undeniable great loss. But it didn't explain the homeless man, the promised miracle, the broken dignity. The pieces seemed to fit, but the overall picture was distorted, incomplete. He returned home with the newspaper clipping, a yellowed piece of paper that carried the promise of a truth and the ambiguity of a lie. The mansion, once a refuge, now seemed a labyrinth of unanswered questions. If the professor was Elias, what had led him to this life? And how had he survived the accident? Or was it just a cruel coincidence? A name and a notebook that deceived him. The feeling that a piece was missing was overwhelming, a gap that logic and reason could not fill. Eduardo spent sleepless nights, rereading the article, observing the blurry photo of the professor that Lucas had taken. He tried to find similarities, differences. The eyes of Elias in the newspaper photo were younger, full of life, while the eyes of the homeless man were marked by pain but had the same intensity. It was like trying to compare two versions of the same song, played in completely different keys, a joyful melody and a melancholic ballad. Uncertainty was torment. He wondered if he was being led by a mirage, by a hope that his own needy soul had fabricated. His distrust, that old companion that protected him, tried to pull him back to the safety of cynicism. But the image of the hungry man, the dignity in his gaze, and the promise of a connection were stronger. He felt he was on the verge of a revelation, but that this revelation would demand from him an openness, a vulnerability he had long forbidden himself. With each discovery, the mystery deepened, and the truth became more elusive. What would he do, after all, with this web of contradictory and painful information? He felt like an archaeologist unearthing a past that wasn't his, but which somehow was becoming his own story. Eduardo could no longer ignore the knot in his throat, the restlessness that consumed him. That newspaper clipping, the name Elias, the leather notebook, everything mingled in his mind, creating a symphony of unanswered questions. He knew he needed to go further, that the truth was there, hidden between the lines of that ancient tragedy and the absurd promise. It was no longer about the miracle of walking, but about the visceral need to understand, to give a name to that broken dignity, to that unwavering faith. He called his lawyer, a trusted man who handled his business, but not mysteries. "I need someone to dig up the past, someone not afraid to stir up old dust," Eduardo explained, his voice firmer than he expected. A few days later, a woman with a penetrating gaze and a briefcase overflowing with documents appeared in his office. Dr. Ana Lucia, a lawyer specializing in complex cases and disappearances, known for her tenacity and for not taking no for an answer. She listened to Eduardo's story with surgical attention, without showing skepticism, only professional curiosity. Ana Lucia delved into Elias's case with the same passion as Eduardo. She reviewed police files, expert reports, and news articles from the time. They were dry, cold documents, already filed away as a closed case. But Ana Lucia had a different eye. She noticed a small inconsistency in the original accident report, a testimony from a local resident who claimed to have seen a figure dragging itself out of the woods, far from the main landslide site, hours after the incident. The testimony had been discarded at the time, attributed to the shock and confusion of the moment. But for Ana Lucia, it was a clue, a loose thread that others had ignored. The lawyer, with her authority and access, managed to reopen some doors. She visited the small town where Elias was from, talked to old neighbors with co-workers. No one had an answer to the mystery of the professor Eduardo had found, but everyone remembered Elias's passion for his studies, for his notes, and for that notebook with a darkened leather cover that he carried everywhere. It was almost an extension of his body, a repository of his soul. The real turning point came when Ana Lucia, following the trail of the figure and the instinct that unrecovered bodies don't always mean dead, accessed records from hospitals and clinics in the region. She looked for entries of unidentified patients in the days and weeks following the accident. The search was vast, almost impossible, but her persistence was rewarded. In a small charity hospital, almost 100 kilometers from Elias's town, she found an intriguing record. A man had been admitted days after the accident, with severe amnesia and injuries consistent with impact, trauma, and exposure. He had no documents, and his description was vague. But one detail caught Ana Lucia's attention, a peculiar scar on his left temple, the result of an old injury. And there it was, in the corner of the admission sheet, a note made by a nurse. "Patient always clutches a small dark leather notebook, even unconscious." Eduardo's heart raced when Ana Lucia showed him the faded copy of the record. It was him. There was no doubt. The man had survived. Elias, the professor, the homeless man, the scar, the notebook, the amnesia, everything fit together in a painful and surprising way. The turnaround was overwhelming. The professor was not a legend nor a charlatan. He was a victim of his own destiny, a man who had lost the memory of who he was, but not the essence of his passion for knowledge and perhaps for miracles. The medical record indicated that the man had been discharged after a few weeks, still without memory, and had disappeared without a trace, likely destined for the streets. The restorative authority, Dr. Ana Lucia, had unraveled the enigma of the professor's identity, but the revelation brought with it a new layer of complexity. If he was Elias, the history professor, why the promise to make Eduardo walk? And what was in that notebook that he guarded so carefully? The feeling that a piece was missing still persisted, but now it was more focused, more palpable. Eduardo felt he was on the right track, that the truth, however harsh, was about to unfold. Elias's life, marked by tragedy and memory loss, mirrored Eduardo's own search for meaning. Both were, in their own way, lost, looking for a connection that would bring them back to reality. The weight of the revelation was immense, but the hope, which he had felt for the first time in the square, now gained firmer contours. He needed to find Elias again, not just to thank him for the food, but to confront the truth, to understand the miracle. Dr. Ana Lucia, with her calm and objective voice, explained that legally, Elias was still considered dead. This meant he had no identity, no rights. He was a social ghost, living on the margins, invisible to the system that had declared him missing. The situation was delicate, but the lawyer was determined to help. She sensed the urgency in Eduardo's eyes, his need to close that cycle, not just for Elias but for himself. The next step would be to find Elias again, but this time with the certainty of who he truly was and with a plan to help him reclaim his life. This discovery changed everything. It was no longer a search for a charlatan or a madman. It was a search for a man, for his story, for his memory, and the promise of the miracle, once so distant and surreal, now seemed to have a basis, a reason for being, even if hidden. The leather notebook, the first piece of evidence, was now the key to unraveling not only Elias's identity, but perhaps the secret of his promise. Eduardo felt that destiny had laid an unexpected path for him, a path that passed through the pain of another to find his own cure. Eduardo and Ana Lucia meticulously planned their next steps. The goal was not just to find Elias, but to approach him with the truth of his identity, with irrefutable proof. They knew that a man who had lived years with amnesia on the streets would require a delicate yet firm approach. The reunion took place in the square, under the same painera tree. Elias was there, like a figure awaiting destiny. Eduardo, with Ana Lucia by his side, approached. The driver, Joaquim, for the first time, seemed more like a bodyguard than a chauffeur. The conversation was slow, laden with emotion. Ana Lucia, with her trained voice, presented the evidence. The newspaper clipping, the hospital record with the scar, the mention of the notebook. Elias listened, his eyes fixed on Eduardo, then on the lawyer. At first incredulity, then a kind of painful recognition. He took out the leather notebook he carried, the same one Eduardo had seen slip, and opened it. The pages were filled with drawings, tiny handwriting, disconnected thoughts, but also excerpts of history, poems about Minas Gerais, fragmented memories of a family. In that notebook, amidst notes and scribbles, Elias had drawn a map. Not a street map, but a map of feelings, of his search for himself. And on one of the pages, a drawing of a man in a wheelchair with the phrase, "The cure lies in the lost connection." The miracle, Eduardo realized, was not physical. It was Elias's ability to see Eduardo's pain, his own search for connection, and to offer what he himself needed: faith in humanity, in rediscovery. Elias, the professor, finally understood. Tears streamed down his scarred face, not from sadness, but from immense relief. Amnesia, the great loss, had stolen his history, but not his essence. He had survived the accident, wandered, lost, but his instinct as a teacher, a guide, remained. The promise to make Eduardo walk was not a physical cure, but a bridge to emotional healing, to reconnection with life, with others. Ana Lucia then explained the next steps. Elias's identity would be legally restored. He would have access to medical care, a home, a dignified life. It wouldn't be easy, but he would no longer be alone. Eduardo, who always distrusted everything and everyone, felt a warmth in his chest. He had helped bring a man back to life, and in the process had allowed life to return to him too. The weight in his legs seemed the same, but the weight in his soul, that indeed was lighter. If this story resonates with something you've experienced, subscribe now and comment on what you would do in Eduardo's shoes. Your support moves these stories. The notebook now was a testament, not only to Elias's life, but to human resilience, to the ability to find purpose even in the deepest adversity. Lucas's photo, the newspaper clipping, the hospital record, everything connected in those pages, revealing the journey of a man who, even without memory, had become a beacon of hope. The truth was more complex and human than any supernatural miracle. It was proof that the greatest healing often doesn't come from divine forces, but from genuine connection between people, from the ability of one gaze to recognize another's pain and extend a hand. Restoration was a chance for a new beginning for Elias and Eduardo's rediscovery. Eduardo, with Ana Lucia's unwavering support, dedicated himself to restoring Elias's life. It was not an easy path. Years of living on the streets had left deep marks, but memory, though fragmented, began to return in small flashes. With a new home and psychological support, Elias, the professor, rediscovered pieces of himself. He remembered his passion for history, the classes he taught, the joy of his family. The leather notebook, once a refuge of confusion, became a diary of his rediscovery, a tangible link to the past he had lost. Eduardo visited Elias regularly, and in these conversations a friendship deepened, transcending their realities. Eduardo realized that the true miracle was not Elias's ability to make him walk, but Elias's ability to make him feel again. To feel connection, empathy, trust. The bitterness that enveloped him, that invisible barrier that isolated him, began to crumble. He learned to look at people not with distrust, but with the curiosity and respect that Elias taught him. With his unwavering dignity, even in misfortune, the millionaire in the wheelchair, who once saw himself trapped in his mansion and in his own pain, found a purpose. He funded a support program for homeless people, inspired by Elias's story, focusing on social reintegration and the recovery of dignity. The mansion, once a sanctuary of silence, filled with life, with projects, with a new kind of hope. Eduardo, though still in his wheelchair, felt freer than ever. He had found the connection he so yearned for, not in physical healing, but in the healing of his soul. The longing to feel the earth beneath his feet was replaced by the joy of feeling humanity in his heart. Poetic justice was done. The man who offered food to someone in need received in return the greatest fortune, the ability to trust and to love. And Elias, the professor, recovered his identity, his history, and the recognition that even in his greatest vulnerability, he had planted a seed of miracle. And so the warm breeze of Ouro Preto, which once carried the weight of a tragedy, now blew with the lightness of a new chance, of a renewed faith in humanity's ability to transform pain into purpose and distrust into unity. In the end, the great lesson that Eduardo and Elias leave us is that the true miracle is not in defying the laws of nature, but in breaking down the barriers of the heart, in seeing others with compassion, and in allowing vulnerability to connect us. The healing, after all, was always in the lost connection. If this story resonated with you, subscribe to the channel now, leave your comment, and hit the like button. Tell me where you're watching from, so I can acknowledge you in the next chapters. Thank you for staying until the end and supporting our channel.